The cruelest thing about heartbreak isn't losing someone, it's watching them stay silent while the world destroys you. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers spilled across the grand ballroom of the Ashford Hotel in Manhattan, washing the room in gold and champagne light while a string quartet played somewhere beneath the hum of expensive laughter. Every table sparkled with polished silverware and towering floral centerpieces flown in from Italy that morning. Men in tailored tuxedos moved through the room with glasses of 12-year scotch in hand. Women in designer gowns smiled carefully rehearsed smiles beside billionaires and politicians. It was the kind of room Claire Donovan had once dreamed of entering as a little girl growing up in a tiny apartment over a laundromat in Brooklyn. Tonight, standing beneath the enormous chandelier in a midnight blue satin dress she had spent 2 months saving for, she realized she still didn't belong here. Claire adjusted the thin silver bracelet on her wrist, trying to steady the nervous trembling in her fingers. Around her, cameras flashed as reporters gathered near the ballroom entrance waiting for Ethan Carlisle to arrive officially with his fiancée. The word still felt strange in her chest. Fiancé. 3 years earlier she had met Ethan at a charity networking event after designing free promotional posters for a local nonprofit. He had looked at her portfolio longer than anyone else ever had. Not because it was perfect. Because he said it felt honest. Honest. Nobody had ever called her work that before. Back then, Ethan Carlisle wasn't just another wealthy man on magazine covers. He was the youngest tech CEO in New York, worth nearly $2 billion before turning 34, known for buying failing companies and turning them into empires. Cold. Brilliant. Untouchable. At least that was what everyone else saw. Claire had seen the exhausted man who stayed awake at 3 in the morning answering emails alone in his penthouse kitchen while eating cold takeout noodles straight from the carton. She had seen the man who secretly donated millions to children's hospitals without attaching his name. The man who once drove across Manhattan during a snowstorm at midnight because she casually mentioned craving hot chocolate after a 16-hour workday. Somewhere between late-night conversations, art museums, quiet breakfasts, and rainy walks through Central Park, Claire had fallen in love with him. The problem was that people like Ethan Carlisle didn't belong to women like Claire Donovan. Not according to New York society. Not according to Vanessa Hale. Oh my God, there she is. Claire's stomach tightened as the sharp voice floated across the ballroom behind her. She turned slowly. Vanessa Hale stood near the center stage in a silver couture gown that probably cost more than Claire earned in 6 months. Tall. Elegant. Perfect blonde waves cascading over one shoulder. The daughter of a real estate dynasty. The woman newspapers once assumed Ethan would marry before Claire unexpectedly entered his life. Vanessa smiled as she approached, but there was nothing warm in it. Claire, she said sweetly, glancing over the dress. You clean up surprisingly well. Claire forced a polite smile. Good evening, Vanessa. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. I heard you designed logos before Ethan rescued you. A few nearby guests laughed softly into their champagne glasses. Claire felt heat creep into her cheeks. I still design, she answered quietly. That's adorable, Vanessa replied. I suppose every billionaire needs a little charity project. Another ripple of laughter. Claire instinctively searched the room for Ethan. He had promised he would only be 30 minutes late after his board meeting. She spotted him near the ballroom entrance speaking with investors. Dark tailored tuxedo. Sharp jawline. Calm blue eyes. Even from across the room, her chest tightened when she looked at him. Ethan glanced toward her briefly. For 1 second their eyes met. Claire silently pleaded for him to come over. To end this. To pull her away from the growing crowd around Vanessa. But then another executive stopped him. Vanessa noticed the look immediately. Her smile widened. Dangerous this time. Actually, Vanessa announced loudly, stepping toward the stage microphone, before Ethan arrives officially, I thought we should celebrate the woman who captured New York's favorite billionaire. Claire's pulse stumbled. Vanessa, relax, Vanessa said lightly. We're all friends here. The giant LED screen behind the ballroom suddenly flickered to life. Claire froze. The first photo appeared instantly. A grainy old picture of Claire working behind the register at a 24-hour copy shop in Queens. Cheap uniform. Hair tied back carelessly. Exhaustion visible under her eyes. Another photo followed. Claire carrying grocery bags through rainwater in worn-out sneakers. Another. Claire sitting on subway stairs sketching designs in an old notebook because she couldn't afford office space. Laughter erupted louder this time across the ballroom. Someone whispered, "No way, that's her." Another voice. "Ethan Carlisle is engaged to that girl?" Claire stopped breathing. Her fingers curled tightly around the small silver clutch in her hand. More photos appeared rapidly across the enormous screen above her head like public evidence in a courtroom. Old apartment listings. Student debt records. Even a blurry photo of Claire leaving a Brooklyn pawn shop after selling jewelry to help pay hospital bills for her mother 2 years earlier. Vanessa slowly took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she purred, "meet the real Claire Donovan." Claire's chest tightened so violently she thought she might collapse right there beneath the chandeliers. Around her, whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. "She used to work at a print shop? I heard her mother had debt collectors after them. God, Ethan must have felt sorry for her." Claire searched desperately for Ethan again. This time he was staring directly at the screen. His expression unreadable. Calm. Too calm. He looked shocked, but he didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't stop it. Vanessa walked closer to Claire with the microphone still in hand. "Tell me, Claire," she asked sweetly enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "when exactly did you fall in love with Ethan? Before or after you discovered he was worth billions?" A few people laughed openly now. Claire's throat burned. She could hear her own heartbeat over the orchestra music. Ethan finally stepped forward from across the ballroom. Relief hit her instantly. He was going to stop this. He had to. But then one of his board members grabbed his arm, whispering urgently into his ear about reporters watching. Ethan hesitated. Just for a second. But sometimes 1 second is enough to destroy a person forever. Claire looked at him across the crowded ballroom. Waiting. Begging silently. "Say something. Please. Defend me. Choose me." Ethan opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Silence. Absolute silence. And in that moment, something inside Claire broke so quietly nobody else in the ballroom noticed it happen. The laughter in the ballroom faded into a dull ringing sound inside Claire Donovan's ears as if the entire room had suddenly slipped underwater. Crystal glasses still clinked somewhere in the distance. Cameras still flashed. The string quartet continued playing soft classical music beneath the chandelier light like nothing devastating had just happened. But Claire could no longer feel any of it. She stood perfectly still beneath the enormous LED screen while another humiliating photo dissolved behind her face. Ethan Carlisle remained frozen across the ballroom, surrounded by executives and reporters, his silence cutting deeper than every cruel word Vanessa Hale had thrown at her. Claire slowly looked around the room one last time. Nobody stepped in. Nobody looked uncomfortable enough to stop it. Some people avoided eye contact entirely. Others whispered behind raised champagne glasses. New York high society loved destruction when it happened in designer clothing. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically, pretending concern now that the damage was done. "Claire," she said softly into the microphone, "you look upset." A few quiet laughs followed again. Claire swallowed hard. Her throat burned so badly she could barely breathe. But somehow she managed to straighten her shoulders. She would not cry here. Not in front of them. Not in front of Ethan. Especially not in front of Ethan. Slowly, carefully, she reached toward her left hand. The diamond engagement ring Ethan had given her caught the ballroom lights as she slipped it off her finger. For one brief second, the room actually became silent. Even Vanessa stopped smiling. Claire walked toward the nearest table without saying a word. The heels Vanessa had mocked only minutes earlier clicked softly against the marble floor beneath the chandelier glow. Claire placed the ring beside an untouched champagne glass directly in front of Ethan's empty seat at the head table. Then she finally looked at him again across the crowded ballroom. Ethan's expression shifted instantly the moment he realized what she was doing. "Claire," he called sharply, stepping forward at last. Too late. She held his gaze for one painful second. "You do not get to protect me after you helped them humiliate me," she said quietly. Her voice was not loud. But somehow every person nearby heard it anyway. Ethan looked stunned. It was not supposed to happen like this. Claire gave a small broken smile. But it did. Vanessa tried to interrupt with a dismissive laugh. "Oh please, do not be dramatic," Claire turned toward her calmly. "You wanted the room to see where I came from," she said. "Congratulations." Then she looked back at Ethan one final time. "The saddest part is not that they laughed," she whispered. "It is that you stood there and let them." Ethan opened his mouth again, but no words came out. Claire nodded once slowly as if finally understanding something she had been refusing to see for years. Then she turned and walked toward the ballroom exit alone. Behind her, reporters immediately started whispering. Camera flashes exploded across the room like lightning. Somebody called her name. Somebody else shouted questions. Claire kept walking. The massive gold doors of the ballroom opened before her, releasing her into the cold silence of the hotel corridor outside. The moment the doors closed behind her, the smile vanished from her face completely. Her breathing turned uneven instantly. She pressed trembling fingers against the marble wall beside the elevator while tears blurred the expensive hallway lights into streaks of gold. A hotel employee standing nearby recognized her immediately and rushed toward her with concern. "Miss Donovan, are you all right?" Claire forced herself upright before the woman could reach her. "I am fine," she whispered automatically. Americans learned young how to say those three words even when they were falling apart. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime. Claire stepped inside alone. The mirrored walls reflected her from every angle. Midnight blue satin dress. Smudged mascara beginning to darken beneath exhausted eyes. Diamond earrings Ethan had chosen for her birthday sparkling under the soft ceiling lights. She looked expensive now. Polished. Elegant. But suddenly she could still see the terrified girl from Brooklyn underneath it all. The girl carrying grocery bags through winter rainwater. The girl sketching logos on subway platforms because coffee shops charged too much to sit inside. The girl who thought being loved by a man like Ethan Carlisle meant she had finally escaped being invisible. The elevator doors closed. And the second they did, Claire collapsed. A sharp sob escaped her chest before she could stop it. She covered her mouth instantly as tears spilled freely down her face. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her heels. "Pull yourself together," she whispered shakily to her reflection. But the reflection staring back looked shattered. The elevator descended floor by floor through the glowing luxury hotel while Claire silently cried against mirrored walls that reflected her heartbreak endlessly back at her. Somewhere above her, Ethan was probably explaining things already. Managing damage. Talking to investors. Fixing headlines. That was what powerful men did best. They survived scandals. Women like Claire simply survived humiliation. The elevator finally reached the underground parking garage. The doors opened onto cold concrete and silence. Claire stepped out slowly, hugging her arms around herself as the freezing Manhattan air swept through the garage entrance nearby. Outside, rain had started falling across the city in thin silver lines. She walked toward the valet station without looking back. Her phone vibrated repeatedly inside her silver clutch. Ethan calling. Again. And again. And again. Claire stared at the screen for several seconds while rainwater dripped from the edges of the parking structure. Ethan Carlisle. The man she once thought would never let her face the world alone. The man who had just watched an entire ballroom destroy her. She declined the call. Seconds later another call appeared. She declined that one too. Then a voicemail notification arrived immediately after. Claire did not listen to it. She slid the phone back into her bag and stepped out into the freezing New York rain. Water soaked through her hair almost instantly. Taxis rushed past glowing streetlights while distant sirens echoed through Manhattan traffic. Claire stood alone on the sidewalk outside one of the richest hotels in the city, feeling poorer than she ever had in her life. A black luxury SUV suddenly pulled sharply to the curb beside her. Ethan stepped out before the driver could even open the door fully. His tuxedo jacket was gone. Rain soaked through his white dress shirt as he rushed toward her. "Claire, wait." She kept walking. "Please." His voice cracked slightly this time. Claire stopped at the edge of the crosswalk but did not turn around. Ethan approached carefully behind her, breathing hard from running. "I was trying to handle it without making things worse." Claire laughed softly at that. Not because it was funny. Because it hurt too much not to. "Worse," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer. "You know Vanessa has been looking for a way to embarrass you for months." "I did not know she had those photos." Claire finally turned toward him. Rain streamed down both of their faces beneath the glowing traffic lights. "But you knew they were laughing at me." Ethan said nothing. Claire nodded slowly. "Exactly." The traffic light changed. Cars rolled past between them. Ethan reached carefully toward her hand, but Claire stepped back before he could touch her. That hurt him visibly. Good. For once she wanted him to feel even a fraction of what she felt standing alone in that ballroom. "Claire, I love you." She closed her eyes briefly at the sound of it. 3 words. Once they would have fixed everything. Tonight they sounded empty. "You loved me when it was easy," she whispered. "But the moment loving me became uncomfortable, you chose silence." Ethan looked genuinely devastated now. But Claire suddenly realized heartbreak and accountability were not the same thing. One did not erase the other. She stepped backward toward the rain-soaked street as another taxi approached slowly through the intersection. "Claire, please do not leave like this." She looked at him one final time beneath the cold Manhattan lights. "You should have stopped me before I broke." Then she climbed into the taxi and disappeared into the rain while Ethan Carlisle stood motionless on the sidewalk watching the woman he loved vanish from his life. By sunrise, the internet had already turned Claire Donovan into entertainment. Her humiliation at the Ashford Hotel spread across social media before the rainwater on Manhattan sidewalks had even dried. Headlines moved fast in New York. Billionaire CEO's mystery fiancé exposed. From Brooklyn copy shop to Carlisle penthouse. The girl who almost married $2 billion. Claire sat silently in the back corner of a yellow taxi while blurry morning light slipped through rain-covered windows. Her phone would not stop vibrating. Hundreds of notifications. Messages from reporters. Former classmates pretending concern. Random strangers debating whether she had truly loved Ethan Carlisle or simply loved what came with his last name. Claire turned the phone off completely and stared out at the gray city passing by outside. Manhattan looked colder in daylight. Less magical. Less forgiving. By the time the taxi reached Brooklyn, her mascara had dried in faint dark lines beneath swollen eyes. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror with quiet sympathy. "Rough night?" Claire forced a tiny smile and handed him cash. "Something like that." She climbed out onto the familiar cracked sidewalk outside her apartment building. The old brick structure stood squeezed between a laundromat and a corner deli that had not changed in 20 years. No doorman. No marble lobby. No cameras flashing. Just chipped stairs and the smell of coffee drifting through cold morning air. For the first time in months, Claire felt relief standing there. Nobody in this neighborhood cared about billionaires. She unlocked the apartment door quietly and stepped inside. The tiny living room was dim except for the soft blue glow of an old television playing morning news at low volume. Her mother, Evelyn Donovan, sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch with a cup of tea trembling slightly in her frail hands. The moment she saw Claire's face, her expression fell. "Oh, sweetheart." That was all it took. Claire crossed the room instantly and collapsed beside her mother, finally allowing herself to cry openly for the first time since leaving the hotel. Evelyn wrapped thin arms around her daughter carefully, holding her the same way she had when Claire was 6 years old, waking up from nightmares during thunderstorms. "I saw some of it online," Evelyn whispered gently. "I turned it off." Claire buried her face against her mother's shoulder. "He said nothing," she whispered brokenly. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly as if those 4 words hurt her too. "Then he failed you." Silence settled between them while the morning news continued murmuring softly in the background. Somewhere on television, financial analysts were probably already discussing Carlyle Technologies stock projections while Claire sat shattered in a tiny Brooklyn apartment trying to remember how to breathe normally again. Evelyn brushed damp hair gently away from Claire's face. "Did you love him?" Claire laughed weakly through tears. "More than I loved myself." Her mother's expression softened with sadness because mothers always knew when their daughters were telling the truth about heartbreak. Claire eventually pulled herself together enough to shower and change into sweatpants and an oversized sweater. She removed the diamond earrings Ethan had given her for her birthday and dropped them quietly into a kitchen drawer without looking at them again. By noon, rain hammered harder against the apartment windows while Claire sat at the tiny kitchen table surrounded by unpaid medical bills. The reality she had ignored while living in Ethan's world waited patiently for her return. Her mother's heart medication had increased in price again. Rent was already overdue by 8 days. Claire's freelance design clients had slowed down months ago after Ethan encouraged her to focus less on survival jobs and more on building a future together. Future. The word suddenly felt embarrassing. Her laptop screen glowed weakly in front of her while she reopened unfinished branding projects she no longer had the energy to complete. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward her silent phone sitting face down on the table. Ethan had called 27 times during the night. He also left 6 voicemails. Claire had not listened to any of them. She was terrified that hearing regret in his voice might weaken her all over again. Around 3 in the afternoon, another call came unexpectedly from St. Catherine Medical Center. Claire's stomach dropped instantly before she even answered. "Miss Donovan?" the nurse asked gently. "Your mother's latest test results came in this morning. Her cardiologist would like to begin treatment adjustments immediately." Claire's fingers tightened around the phone. "How much will it cost?" There was a pause on the other end. Never a good sign. "Your insurance only covers part of the procedure." Claire closed her eyes. "How much?" "Approximately $32,000. $32,000 might as well have been 32 million in that moment. Claire thanked the nurse quietly before ending the call. Then she simply sat there staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper in the kitchen while cold fear settled slowly into her chest. Ethan would have solved this with one phone call. One signature. One casual transfer of money he would barely notice missing. But Claire suddenly realized accepting help from him now would destroy what little dignity she still had left. The apartment buzzer rang unexpectedly downstairs. Claire frowned and walked slowly toward the intercom. "Yeah?" "Delivery for Miss Donovan." Her chest tightened instantly. "Ethan." "Of course." 5 minutes later, 3 enormous white floral arrangements filled the tiny apartment living room. Luxury roses. Orchids. Peonies flown in from somewhere expensive. A handwritten note rested delicately between the flowers in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Claire stared at it for several seconds before finally opening it. "Claire, I know sorry is not enough. Please let me explain everything face to face. I love you. Ethan." Claire looked at the flowers silently. Then at the expensive note card. Then around the tiny apartment where her mother quietly pretended not to watch her heartbreak unfold again. Suddenly the flowers felt insulting. Beautiful things powerful men sent when they failed to protect the women they claimed to love. Claire picked up the note slowly, folded it once, and dropped it directly into the kitchen trash can. Her mother watched quietly. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded. "If he really loved me," she whispered, "he would have defended me before the world saw me bleeding." Evening settled heavily across Brooklyn while cold rain continued falling outside. Claire eventually sat alone beside the apartment window with her old sketchbook balanced on her knees. The same sketchbook Ethan once told her would someday build an empire if she believed in herself enough. Her fingers traced unfinished logo designs absent-mindedly beneath dim apartment light. Fashion branding concepts. Luxury packaging ideas. Elegant typography sketches nobody important had ever taken seriously. Except Ethan. That memory hurt most of all. He had once believed in her talent before society convinced him she did not belong beside him. A sudden coughing fit echoed sharply from the living room. Claire looked up instantly. Her mother struggled slightly for breath while gripping the couch arm for support. Panic flashed through Claire's body immediately. She rushed across the apartment. "Mom?" Evelyn forced a reassuring smile even while breathing unevenly. "I am all right." But Claire could see the exhaustion beneath her mother's eyes now. The weakness. The fear she tried hiding. And in that exact moment Claire understood something terrifying. She no longer had the luxury of breaking down. Not completely. Not yet. Because life did not pause simply because your heart had been destroyed. Rent still existed. Hospitals still called. Bills still arrived. Sick mothers still needed medicine. Claire helped Evelyn back beneath the blanket carefully before returning to the kitchen alone. Rainwater streaked down the dark apartment window while Manhattan's distant skyline glowed faintly across the river like another universe entirely. Ethan Carlisle was probably standing inside a penthouse somewhere regretting everything now. But regret did not pay medical bills. Regret did not erase humiliation. And regret definitely did not rebuild broken women. Claire slowly opened her laptop again. Then she began searching freelance branding opportunities across New York with trembling fingers and swollen eyes while the city outside continued moving forward without mercy. For the next 6 weeks, Claire Donovan learned that heartbreak became easier to survive when exhaustion replaced it. Every morning started before sunrise inside the tiny Brooklyn apartment while gray winter light barely touched the windows. She brewed cheap coffee, reviewed freelance applications, called medical insurance companies that kept placing her on hold for 40 minutes at a time, then spent afternoons caring for her mother between design projects that paid barely enough to keep the lights on. The glamorous world of Manhattan galas and penthouse dinners already felt like another lifetime. Sometimes Claire caught herself wondering if she had imagined the entire relationship with Ethan Carlisle. But then she would open a kitchen drawer searching for pens or receipts and accidentally see the diamond earrings still sitting there untouched beneath old utility bills. Reality returned instantly after that. Ethan never stopped trying to contact her. Flowers arrived twice more during the first week. Then handwritten letters. Then expensive meals delivered from restaurants she once loved. Claire sent everything back unopened. Finally the gifts stopped. The silence that followed somehow hurt even more. One freezing Thursday afternoon, Claire sat inside a crowded coffee shop in Lower Manhattan trying to finish a branding pitch for a struggling skincare startup. Snow drifted outside the windows while exhausted commuters hurried through slush-covered sidewalks beneath glowing traffic lights. The coffee shop smelled like espresso beans and wet coats. Indie music hummed softly overhead while laptops glowed across nearly every table. Claire rubbed tired eyes and stared down at the unfinished logo design on her screen. Her mother's latest treatment payment was due in 4 days. She was $300 short already. Her landlord had started leaving polite but increasingly tense reminders taped beside the apartment mailbox downstairs. And despite everything, Claire still could not force herself to use Ethan's name for opportunities the way everyone expected. Several clients had already hinted that reconnecting publicly with Ethan Carlisle could instantly launch her career. She refused every suggestion immediately. She would rather fail honestly than survive as someone's discarded charity case. Claire closed her laptop briefly and pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. Sleep had become rare lately. She barely noticed the elegant older woman seated alone 2 tables away watching her quietly over a cup of untouched tea. The woman appeared to be somewhere in her late 60s with silver hair styled perfectly beneath a cream wool coat that probably cost more than Claire's monthly rent. Graceful. Composed. The kind of woman New York restaurants treated differently the second she walked through the door. Claire returned to her laptop and forced herself to continue working. A young barista approached moments later carrying fresh coffee. "Courtesy of the woman over there," he said softly, nodding toward the older stranger. Claire blinked in surprise. "Oh. I think there is a mistake." The barista smiled slightly. She insisted. Before Claire could protest further, the older woman stood and approached her table directly. "You look like someone carrying the weight of a collapsing empire," the woman said calmly. Claire gave an awkward smile. "Unfortunately, the empire is more like overdue rent and medical debt." The woman's lips curved faintly. "Sometimes those are the same thing." Claire noticed several people inside the coffee shop glancing toward the woman with quiet recognition. But she could not place the face. "Please," the woman said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "May I?" Claire nodded politely. The woman sat gracefully across from her and glanced briefly at the branding sketches scattered across the table. "You designed these?" Claire instinctively moved the papers closer to herself. "Just freelance work." "No," the woman replied immediately. "This is not just freelance work. This is instinct." Claire looked confused. The woman picked up one of the logo drafts carefully. "Most people create branding that screams for attention," she said. "This whispers confidence instead." Claire stared at her silently for a second. "Thank you." The woman studied her face more closely now. "Claire Donovan." It was not a question. Claire's chest tightened slightly. Here it comes again. Recognition. Pity. Gossip. "You saw the videos online," Claire said quietly. The woman nodded once. "I did." Claire looked away toward the snowy Manhattan street outside. "Then you probably already know how the story ends." "No," the woman replied softly. "I think I only saw where the story actually begins." Claire frowned slightly at that. The woman extended her hand elegantly across the table. "Margaret Laurent." The name hit instantly this time. Claire's eyes widened in shock. Margaret Laurent was practically royalty in the luxury fashion and branding world. Founder of Laurent International. Billionaire investor. One of the most powerful women in New York business circles. Claire nearly dropped her coffee cup. "Oh my God." Margaret smiled calmly. "That reaction gets exhausting after 30 years. Claire straightened immediately, embarrassed now by the cluttered table, her tired appearance, the cheap sweater she had thrown on this morning without thinking. "I am sorry, I did not recognize you." "That is because you were too busy surviving." Margaret glanced again toward the unfinished logo presentation on Claire's laptop screen. "Tell me about this campaign." Claire hesitated. "It is not finished." "Neither are you," Margaret replied simply. "Go on." Something about the woman's voice made Claire obey without realizing it. Over the next 20 minutes, she carefully explained her branding concept for the startup. Color psychology. Minimalist packaging strategy. Emotional luxury marketing. How people did not buy products anymore. They bought identity. Escape. Belonging. Claire spoke faster as passion slowly replaced exhaustion in her voice. Her hands moved instinctively while describing typography choices and visual storytelling. For the first time in weeks, she forgot to feel broken. Margaret listened without interrupting once. When Claire finally stopped talking, the older woman leaned back slightly in her chair and studied her with unreadable eyes. Interesting, she murmured. Claire suddenly felt self-conscious again. I know it probably sounds unrealistic. No, Margaret said softly. It sounds expensive. Claire blinked. Margaret smiled faintly. That is a compliment. Snow continued falling heavily outside while Manhattan traffic crawled through crowded streets beyond the coffee shop windows. Margaret reached slowly into her designer handbag and removed a sleek black business card. She placed it carefully beside Claire's laptop. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9. Claire stared at the card in disbelief. For what? For a conversation that could change your life if you are brave enough to stop thinking like someone waiting to be rescued. Claire looked stunned. Mrs. Laurent, with all respect, I think you are overestimating me. Margaret's expression sharpened slightly. No. You are underestimating yourself. Silence settled between them briefly. Margaret glanced around the crowded coffee shop before looking back at Claire. Do you know what the problem with broken women is? Claire swallowed nervously. What? Margaret's eyes softened just slightly. Eventually they stop fearing loss. The words landed somewhere deep inside Claire's chest. Margaret stood gracefully and adjusted her coat. Tomorrow. 9 o'clock. Then she paused before walking away completely. And Claire? Claire looked up. Never allow the worst thing that happened to you become the most interesting thing about you. Then Margaret Laurent disappeared through the coffee shop doors into the falling Manhattan snow while Claire sat frozen beside her untouched coffee staring down at the black business card in her trembling hands. Laurent International. 5th Avenue. Penthouse level. Claire looked out the window at the city skyline glowing cold and silver beyond the storm. For the first time since the night her heart shattered beneath ballroom chandeliers, something unfamiliar flickered quietly inside her chest again. Not hope exactly. Something harder. Something sharper. Like survival beginning to transform into ambition. Claire Donovan spent the entire subway ride home staring at Margaret Laurent's black business card like it might disappear if she blinked too hard. Around her, exhausted New Yorkers swayed quietly beneath flickering fluorescent lights while the train rattled through underground tunnels toward Brooklyn. Nobody on the subway knew the woman sitting near the back corner had just been invited into one of the most powerful business empires in Manhattan. Nobody knew she had almost married Ethan Carlisle. Nobody knew she was holding together an entire collapsing life with sheer exhaustion and stubbornness. And somehow Claire preferred it that way. The city became easier to survive when nobody was watching you fail. By the time she reached the apartment building, snow covered the sidewalks in thin gray slush while freezing wind cut sharply between buildings. Claire climbed the stairs slowly, still replaying Margaret's words in her head. Broken women stop fearing loss. The sentence unsettled her because deep down she knew it was true. Losing Ethan had shattered something enormous inside her. But after humiliation, heartbreak, debt, fear, and public embarrassment, what exactly was left to terrify her now? The apartment smelled faintly like tomato soup when Claire stepped inside. Her mother sat wrapped in blankets beside the television while an old jazz station played softly in the background. Evelyn immediately noticed the strange expression on Claire's face. What happened? Claire hesitated before removing the black business card from her coat pocket and placing it carefully on the kitchen counter. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and stared down at the elegant gold lettering. Then her eyes widened instantly. Margaret Laurent? Claire nodded slowly. She wants me to meet her tomorrow. Evelyn looked stunned for several seconds before smiling softly for the first time in weeks. Claire, I know, Claire whispered. It sounds insane. Her mother reached for her hand gently. No, sweetheart. It sounds earned. Claire looked away quickly because compliments suddenly felt dangerous after everything she had survived lately. That night she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, memories collided violently together. The ballroom humiliation. Ethan standing silent beneath chandelier light. Hospital bills scattered across the kitchen table. Margaret Lauren's calm voice cutting through the noise like steel wrapped in silk. Around 4 in the morning, Claire finally gave up trying to rest. She sat at the tiny kitchen table wearing oversized pajamas while snow drifted outside the apartment windows and began reviewing every branding project she had ever created. Old sketches. Packaging concepts. Fashion campaign drafts. Coffee shop logos. Restaurant rebrands. Ideas nobody powerful had ever looked at twice before. By sunrise, papers covered nearly every inch of the kitchen. Claire had dark circles beneath her eyes and cold coffee sitting untouched beside her laptop. But for the first time in months, exhaustion felt connected to purpose instead of survival. At exactly 8:15, Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror trying to decide which version of herself deserved to walk into L'Oréal International headquarters. The broken girl from Brooklyn? The disgraced almost fiancé splashed across tabloids? The exhausted daughter drowning in debt? Or the designer Margaret Lauren somehow believed was hiding underneath all of it? Finally Claire chose simplicity. Black slacks. Cream blouse. Minimal makeup. Hair pulled back neatly. No expensive jewelry. No performance. Just herself. Manhattan looked silver and sharp beneath winter sunlight as Claire emerged from the subway near Fifth Avenue. Towering glass buildings reflected cold morning skies while luxury stores displayed handbags worth more than most people's monthly salaries. L'Oréal International occupied one of the tallest towers in the district. The lobby alone felt intimidating enough to make Claire second-guess entering. Marble floors. Massive crystal installations. Quiet elegance designed to remind people power lived here. Claire approached the reception desk carefully. "I have a meeting with Margaret Lauren." The receptionist immediately smiled politely. "Miss Donovan. She is expecting you." That alone startled Claire slightly. Margaret Lauren did not strike her as the type of woman who waited for anyone. Minutes later, Claire stepped into a private elevator that carried her silently toward the penthouse offices overlooking Manhattan. Her pulse quickened with every passing floor. When the elevator doors opened, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire New York skyline glowing beneath winter sunlight. It looked less like an office and more like a kingdom suspended above the city. Margaret stood near the windows holding espresso in one hand while reviewing documents with two sharply dressed executives. The moment she noticed Claire, she dismissed them calmly without interrupting the conversation. Power. Real power. Quiet power. Claire noticed the difference instantly. "You came," Margaret said simply. Claire nodded nervously. "I almost did not." "Good," Margaret replied. "Fear ruins more lives than failure." Margaret gestured toward a sleek conference table covered in luxury branding campaigns from around the world. Fashion houses. Jewelry brands. International hotels. Multi-million-dollar campaigns Claire recognized instantly. "Tell me what is wrong with them," Margaret said. Claire blinked. "Excuse me?" "Every single campaign on this table has already made millions," Margaret continued calmly. "Now tell me why they still fail." Claire hesitated for several seconds. "You want me to criticize your clients?" Margaret sat down slowly. "I want honesty. Most people are too afraid to offer it." Silence stretched briefly across the massive office while Manhattan glittered outside the windows. Then Claire carefully picked up the first campaign presentation. Luxury perfume branding. Elegant. Expensive. Forgettable. "This one is trying too hard to look rich," Claire admitted quietly. Margaret raised one eyebrow. Claire continued slowly, growing more confident as instinct took over. "Luxury customers do not buy products to impress strangers anymore. They buy emotional identity. Security. Escape. This campaign feels beautiful but emotionally empty." Margaret said nothing. Claire moved to another presentation. Then another. Soon 30 minutes disappeared completely while Claire dismantled million-dollar branding strategies with surprising precision. Some lacked emotional storytelling. Others misunderstood modern audiences entirely. Claire spoke faster as passion replaced nervousness again. She forgot to sound careful. Forgot to sound grateful. Forgot to sound small. Finally, Margaret leaned back in her chair and smiled faintly. There she is. Claire stopped mid-sentence. Who? The woman hiding underneath all that heartbreak. Claire looked down immediately, embarrassed by how much she had revealed without meaning to. Margaret studied her carefully for a moment before speaking again. Do you know why I asked you here? Claire shook her head. Margaret walked toward the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Because the entire city currently sees you as a victim. Claire stiffened slightly. I am not asking for pity. I know, Margaret replied. That is precisely why you interest me. She turned back slowly. Most people spend their lives desperate for approval from rooms full of strangers. But humiliation either destroys a woman or removes her fear permanently. Claire remained silent. Margaret crossed the room and handed her a thick black folder. Inside is a 6-month international consulting contract with L'Oréal International. Claire stared at the folder without touching it. What? Paris. Milan. New York. Luxury rebranding division. Claire's heart nearly stopped. Mrs. L'Oréal, you will work harder than you ever have in your life, Margaret interrupted calmly. You will be underestimated constantly. Men with half your talent will speak over you in meetings. Society pages will continue discussing your failed engagement instead of your intelligence. Claire swallowed hard. Margaret stepped closer now. But if you survive the next 6 months, nobody will ever be able to humiliate you again. The office fell completely silent after that. Claire looked down at the black folder in her trembling hands while sunlight spilled across the Manhattan skyline behind Margaret L'Oréal like another world waiting just beyond reach. Slowly, Claire opened the contract. The salary alone was more money than she had ever seen attached to her own name before. Her chest tightened instantly. Medical bills. Rent. Stability. A future. Everything she had spent months desperately trying to hold together suddenly shifted within reach. But more than that, Claire realized this was the first opportunity anyone had ever offered her that was not connected to Ethan Carlisle. This was hers. Entirely hers. Margaret watched the realization settle across her face quietly. So, she asked softly, are you ready to stop surviving and start becoming dangerous? Claire looked out across Manhattan one long moment before answering. Somewhere inside that enormous city, Ethan Carlisle was still waking up every morning believing he had lost the woman he loved. He had no idea he was actually witnessing the creation of someone he would never fully be able to reach again. Claire finally looked back at Margaret L'Oréal with steady eyes. When do I start? The next 6 months transformed Claire Donovan so completely that even she barely recognized the woman staring back from hotel mirrors across Europe. Paris came first. Then Milan. Then London. Then Manhattan again. Her days blurred into luxury showrooms, private investor dinners, midnight branding revisions, and conference rooms filled with executives twice her age testing whether she belonged there. Margaret L'Oréal had not exaggerated a single thing. Men interrupted her constantly during meetings until Claire learned how to continue speaking without raising her voice. Fashion executives dismissed her ideas right before repeating them 5 minutes later as if they were their own. Wealthy clients smiled politely at first glance, then quietly searched her online history after recognizing her face from old scandal headlines. The internet never forgot humiliation. But slowly, something changed. Claire stopped entering rooms hoping to be accepted. She started entering rooms expecting to be heard. And somehow that changed everything. One rainy evening in Paris, Claire stood inside L'Oréal International's temporary office overlooking the Seine while dozens of exhausted employees scrambled to fix a collapsing luxury cosmetics campaign only 48 hours before launch. The client threatened to pull $20 million if the branding presentation failed again. Senior executives argued loudly around glass conference tables while assistants rushed through the room carrying samples and revised mock-ups. Claire quietly observed everything from the corner for almost an hour before finally speaking. The campaign is failing because it looks expensive instead of intimate. The room fell silent instantly. One executive gave her a tired look. We are marketing a luxury product. It is supposed to look expensive. Claire shook her head calmly. No. Wealth whispers. Insecurity screams. Margaret Laurent, seated near the far end of the conference table, slowly smiled into her espresso cup without saying a word. Claire stepped forward toward the digital presentation screen. This campaign keeps trying to convince women they should envy the brand, she continued. But modern luxury is emotional now. Women do not want products that make them feel excluded. They want products that make them feel understood. Another executive frowned skeptically. And you know this because? Claire looked directly at him. Because I spent my entire life outside rooms designed to make people feel small. Silence. Then Margaret finally stood. Implement her revisions. The campaign launched 3 days later and became the most profitable beauty rebrand Laurent International had produced in 4 years. After that, people stopped interrupting Claire quite as often. By the end of the first year, fashion magazines started mentioning her quietly in business articles. The strategic mind behind Laurent International's new luxury renaissance. The mysterious branding consultant reshaping modern elegance. Nobody connected her immediately to the crying woman who once walked out of the Ashford Hotel beneath camera flashes and public humiliation. Claire preferred it that way. She worked constantly. Not because she was chasing money anymore. Because work gave her control. Structure. Distance from heartbreak. Some nights she still woke unexpectedly at 3 a.m. remembering Ethan standing silently beneath chandelier light while the ballroom laughed around her. But the memories hurt differently now. Less like open wounds. More like scars she refused to touch. Her mother's health improved gradually too. Margaret quietly arranged the best cardiologist in New York without making a spectacle of it. Claire cried privately after the appointment because kindness without humiliation still felt unfamiliar to her. Evelyn eventually moved into a small sunlit apartment overlooking the Brooklyn waterfront where she spent afternoons reading novels and pretending not to notice her daughter slowly transforming into someone impossible to underestimate. One evening after returning from Milan Fashion Week, Claire unlocked the door to her Manhattan apartment and froze when she saw the garment bag hanging beside the window. A custom ivory silk gown rested inside. Elegant. Minimalist. Timeless. Attached was a handwritten note from Margaret. Wear this tomorrow night. Claire frowned slightly. Laurent International rarely hosted formal events without warning. Her phone buzzed seconds later. Margaret's assistant. Miss Laurent would like you at tomorrow evening's gala. Black tie. 7 o'clock sharp. What gala? Claire asked. A brief pause followed. The Carlyle Global Innovation Summit. Silence crashed heavily through Claire's chest. Ethan Carlyle. She had not seen him once in nearly 3 years. Not after Paris. Not after London. Not after transforming herself into someone too busy to miss him publicly. But privately? Some losses settled permanently inside people no matter how successful they became afterward. Claire walked slowly toward the apartment window overlooking Manhattan's glowing skyline while her pulse turned uneven again for the first time in months. Why does Margaret want me there? She asked quietly. Because Laurent International is acquiring partial partnership rights tomorrow evening. Another pause. And because your name was personally added to the guest of honor list. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Of course Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. The next evening Manhattan glittered beneath cold winter rain while black luxury cars lined the entrance of the Carlyle Grand Hotel downtown. Camera flashes exploded across red carpets as billionaires, celebrities, and politicians stepped beneath towering crystal chandeliers into one of the most exclusive events in New York business culture. Inside a private penthouse suite upstairs, Claire stood motionless before a floor-length mirror while a stylist adjusted the final details of her gown. Ivory silk draped perfectly against her figure. Diamond earrings shimmered softly beneath elegant waves of blonde hair falling across one shoulder. Sophisticated. Untouchable. Not because of the dress. Because heartbreak had taught her how to survive rooms designed to destroy weaker versions of herself. Margaret entered quietly behind her. Nervous? Claire met the older woman's reflection through the mirror. No, Margaret smiled faintly. Good. Fear would ruin the entrance. Downstairs, the ballroom overflowed with reporters and executives beneath enormous gold chandeliers while a live orchestra played near the marble staircase. Ethan Carlyle stood near the center of the room speaking with investors while exhaustion hid carefully behind his calm expression. 3 years had sharpened him somehow. More controlled. Colder. But there was something heavier in his eyes now too. Something restless. Rumors about his life had spread steadily through Manhattan over the past year. Vanessa Hale gone. Engagement destroyed. Board tensions increasing. Endless work. Endless silence. People whispered that Ethan Carlyle had become impossible to reach personally after the woman he once planned to marry disappeared from his life completely. Ethan barely noticed the conversations around him anymore. Then the ballroom lights shifted suddenly toward the entrance staircase above. Conversations quieted instantly. The announcer's voice echoed elegantly across the room. Ladies and gentlemen. L'Oréal International proudly welcomes tonight's guest of honor. Ethan glanced toward the staircase absent-mindedly at first. Then completely froze. Claire Donovan descended the marble staircase slowly beneath chandelier light while the entire ballroom fell silent around her. Ivory silk. Diamond earrings. Calm, unreadable expression. Every movement elegant enough to command attention without asking for it. Camera flashes erupted instantly across the ballroom. People whispered in stunned disbelief. Some recognized her immediately. Others recognized only power. Ethan forgot how to breathe for one impossible second. Because the woman walking toward him no longer resembled the broken girl who once stood crying beneath humiliation while he failed to protect her. This woman looked like she had rebuilt herself from the ashes of that night and buried every weakness beneath elegance sharp enough to cut glass. Claire reached the bottom staircase step calmly while reporters scrambled around the ballroom trying to process what they were seeing. Margaret Laurent appeared beside her moments later, proud and composed. You clean up well, Margaret murmured softly. Claire's lips curved slightly. I learned from professionals. Across the room, Ethan stared at Claire like the entire world around him had disappeared. She finally looked at him directly after 3 years of silence. No anger. No tears. No desperation. Just composed distance. The kind that terrified powerful men most because it meant they no longer had influence over the woman standing in front of him. Ethan slowly stepped toward her through the silent ballroom while his heartbeat pounded hard enough to drown out the orchestra music entirely. Claire watched him approach without moving. Without flinching. Without breaking. Then Ethan finally stopped directly in front of her beneath the same kind of chandelier light that once witnessed her heartbreak years earlier. His voice came out quieter than expected. Claire. She held his gaze calmly for several endless seconds before answering. Mr. Carlyle. And somehow hearing his name spoken like that hurt Ethan far more than hatred ever could. The silence between Claire Donovan and Ethan Carlyle lasted only a few seconds inside the glittering ballroom, but to Ethan it felt long enough to relive every mistake he had made over the past 3 years. Around them, reporters whispered furiously while camera flashes burst across the marble hall like tiny explosions of light. Nobody could stop staring at the woman standing beside Margaret Laurent. 3 years ago Claire had entered rooms nervously, quietly adjusting sleeves or lowering her gaze whenever wealthy people looked at her too long. Tonight she stood beneath crystal chandeliers with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed permission to belong anywhere. Ethan could not stop looking at her. The ivory silk gown draped elegantly against her figure, but it was not the dress that unsettled him. It was her eyes. They no longer searched his face for reassurance. They no longer softened automatically when he spoke. Claire looked at him now the way powerful people looked at strangers. Polite. Controlled. Untouchable. Margaret Laurent stepped smoothly into the tension before it could become public spectacle. "Ethan," she said calmly, extending one hand. "Thank you for hosting such a beautiful evening." Ethan forced himself to regain composure and shook Margaret's hand automatically, though his attention never fully left Claire. "Margaret," he replied evenly. "Always a pleasure." Margaret smiled faintly. "I believe your investors are eager to meet the woman responsible for our newest international expansion strategy." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he finally looked back toward Claire. "You are working directly with Laurent International now?" Claire met his gaze calmly. "I lead their luxury brand division." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Lead. Not assist. Not freelance. Lead. Before he could respond, several executives approached quickly, clearly eager to speak with Claire. "Miss Donovan," one man said excitedly, "your Milan campaign increased market engagement by 40%. Extraordinary work." Another added immediately, "The Laurent rebrand in Paris was genius. Everyone in the industry is talking about it." Claire thanked them politely while Ethan stood beside her listening in stunned silence. 3 years ago those same kinds of executives barely acknowledged her existence. Now they competed for her attention. The irony tasted bitter in Ethan's chest. Across the ballroom, Vanessa Hale entered beneath a burst of camera flashes wearing a shimmering silver gown that turned heads instantly. But the attention lasted only seconds before whispers shifted back toward Claire again. Vanessa noticed immediately. Her expression darkened subtly as her eyes locked onto Claire standing beside Ethan beneath the chandeliers. For one brief second, genuine shock crossed Vanessa's face. Because the woman she once humiliated publicly had not returned broken. She had returned more powerful than everyone expected. Vanessa approached slowly with practiced elegance while reporters immediately drifted closer hoping for tension. "Claire," Vanessa said smoothly, though her smile looked tighter than before. "What an unexpected surprise." Claire turned toward her calmly. "Good evening, Vanessa." Vanessa glanced briefly over Claire's gown and jewelry before forcing another smile. "You look different." Claire's lips curved faintly. People usually do after surviving public humiliation. Silence snapped instantly across the nearby crowd. Ethan looked down briefly, guilt flashing through his expression before he masked it again. Vanessa laughed lightly, pretending the comment had not landed directly where intended. "Well, clearly everything worked out for you." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Eventually." Margaret Laurent watched the exchange quietly beside them like a queen observing chess pieces already several moves behind. Vanessa turned toward Ethan now, slipping one hand lightly around his arm possessively. "Ethan was just about to introduce me to the investors from Dubai," she said sweetly. "Perhaps we can all catch up later." Claire noticed the gesture immediately. So did Ethan. And somehow the sight of Vanessa touching him stirred absolutely nothing inside Claire anymore. No jealousy. No heartbreak. Just distance. That realization startled her more than anything else tonight. Ethan carefully removed Vanessa's hand from his arm without looking at her. "Actually," he said calmly, "eyes still fixed on Claire, I would like a moment alone with Miss Donovan first." Vanessa's expression froze almost imperceptibly. Around them, several nearby guests exchanged subtle looks instantly. Margaret hid a small smile behind her champagne glass. Claire remained perfectly composed. "I am sure your guests need you," she replied politely. Ethan stepped slightly closer anyway. 5 minutes. Claire studied him carefully. 3 years ago she would have given him anything for 5 honest minutes. Tonight she simply glanced toward Margaret. The older woman gave a barely noticeable nod before drifting gracefully toward another cluster of executives, intentionally leaving them alone. Ethan exhaled slowly once the crowd moved a respectful distance away. You disappeared. Claire looked toward the ballroom orchestra instead of him. No. I left. Ethan swallowed hard. I looked for you everywhere. Claire finally looked back at him. That is interesting. Why? Because when I actually needed you to find your voice, she said quietly, you could not. Ethan flinched slightly like the words physically hit him. God, he had missed her voice. Even now. Especially now. Claire's calmness made every sentence cut deeper because she no longer sounded emotional enough to lose control. Ethan lowered his voice further. I deserve that. Claire gave a small humorless smile. That is probably the first honest thing you have said to me tonight. Around them, the gala continued sparkling beneath chandelier light while wealthy strangers laughed and toasted billion-dollar deals. But Ethan barely noticed any of it anymore. All he could see was Claire standing in front of him, transformed into the exact kind of woman New York respected most. Not because she married wealth. Because she became impossible to dismiss without consequences. You look happy, Ethan said quietly. Claire considered the question carefully. I look peaceful. The answer somehow hurt more. Ethan glanced down briefly before speaking again. I never stopped thinking about you. Claire's expression did not change. That must have been difficult. He almost laughed at the cold elegance in her tone. Almost. Instead he studied her face carefully, searching for traces of the woman who once stayed awake with him until 2 a.m. eating Chinese takeout on penthouse floors while discussing impossible dreams. Claire, her name sounded dangerous in his voice now. Familiar enough to reopen old wounds if she allowed it. She did not. Mr. Carlyle, she corrected gently. Ethan's jaw tightened again. Do not do that. Do what? Pretend we are strangers. Claire held his gaze steadily. We are strangers. Silence settled heavily between them again. Ethan realized with sudden panic that she genuinely meant it. Somewhere over the last 3 years, Claire Donovan had learned how to survive without needing him emotionally anymore. And for a man who spent his entire life controlling outcomes, that terrified him more than losing money ever could. Across the ballroom, a large digital screen suddenly lit up announcing the evening's upcoming keynote presentation. Guests slowly returned toward the main stage area while servers carried trays of champagne through the crowd. Ethan looked at Claire carefully one more time. There are things you do not know about what happened that night. Claire's expression cooled instantly. There is nothing complicated about silence, Ethan. Hearing his first name from her lips after so long almost weakened him physically. But before he could answer, the ballroom announcer's voice echoed loudly overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carlyle Technologies founder and chief executive officer, Ethan Carlyle. Applause erupted immediately across the room. Ethan glanced toward the stage reluctantly before looking back at Claire. Please do not leave tonight before we talk again. Claire picked up a champagne glass from a passing tray without breaking eye contact. That depends. On what? Claire took one slow sip before answering softly. Whether you are finally brave enough to hear the truth. Then she walked past him gracefully toward the investors gathering near Margaret Laurent while Ethan remained standing motionless beneath chandelier light watching the woman he once loved move through the ballroom like someone completely beyond his reach. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carlyle understood what helplessness actually felt like. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as Ethan Carlyle stepped onto the stage beneath a storm of camera flashes and polite applause. From across the crowded room, Claire Donovan watched him calmly beside Margaret Laurent while servers moved through the audience carrying crystal champagne glasses and gold-trimmed dessert trays. 3 years ago, watching Ethan command a room like this would have filled Claire with admiration. Tonight she studied him differently. More carefully. More honestly. Power looked exhausting on him now. Ethan adjusted the microphone with composed precision while the massive digital screens behind him displayed the Carlyle Technologies logo across shimmering blue light. Investors, celebrities, and international executives filled every seat in the ballroom waiting for the billionaire CEO to speak. Ethan usually thrived in moments like this. Public speaking had never intimidated him. But tonight his attention kept drifting back toward Claire standing beneath the chandeliers wearing ivory silk and emotional distance like armor. He had spent 3 years imagining this moment constantly. What he would say if he ever saw her again. How he would explain himself. How he would apologize properly. But somehow none of those imagined conversations prepared him for the reality of Claire looking at him without love in her eyes anymore. Ethan forced himself to focus on the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began smoothly. "Tonight represents more than innovation and investment. It represents transformation." Claire nearly smiled at the irony. Transformation. Nobody in the room understood that word better than she did. Ethan continued speaking confidently about expansion projects, global partnerships, and the future of Carlisle Technologies while applause periodically rippled across the ballroom. But Claire noticed the subtle cracks beneath his polished performance immediately. The slight tension in his jaw. The way exhaustion lingered beneath his eyes. The pauses lasting half a second too long whenever his gaze accidentally found hers in the crowd. Margaret Laurent noticed too. "He still loves you," she murmured quietly beside Claire. Claire lifted her champagne glass slowly. "That sounds unfortunate for him." Margaret glanced sideways at her with faint amusement. "Cold." Claire stared toward the stage calmly. "No." "Careful." Across the ballroom, Vanessa Hale watched the exchange between Claire and Margaret with growing irritation. The evening had shifted completely away from her the second Claire entered the room. Investors wanted introductions. Reporters wanted comments. Even socialites who once mocked Claire now competed for invitations to her table. Vanessa recognized danger when she saw it. Women like Claire became impossible to control once they stopped needing approval. Ethan finished his speech beneath strong applause before stepping away from the podium. Almost instantly, reporters and executives surrounded him near the stage. Yet his eyes searched the ballroom for only one person. Claire had already moved toward a quieter balcony corridor overlooking Manhattan. Cold winter rain streaked softly against the towering windows while the city glittered below like scattered diamonds. Claire welcomed the temporary silence. Large galas always exhausted her eventually, no matter how comfortable she learned to appear inside them. The balcony doors opened quietly behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who followed. Ethan stepped beside her slowly, hands resting inside the pockets of his tailored tuxedo while rain tapped gently against the glass beside them. For several seconds neither spoke. Manhattan stretched endlessly below them, glowing silver and gold beneath the storm clouds. "You used to love this view," Ethan said quietly. Claire looked out across the skyline. "I loved who I was when I looked at it." Ethan absorbed the answer silently. "Claire, do not," she interrupted softly. "Do not stand here pretending nostalgia fixes anything." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "I know it does not." Claire finally turned toward him fully beneath the soft balcony lighting. Up close, she noticed details she had almost forgotten. The faint scar near his jaw from a skiing accident years ago. The way stress tightened the corners of his mouth now. The sadness hiding carefully behind controlled blue eyes. Loving him once had trained her to notice every tiny fracture. Ethan met her gaze carefully. "You disappeared completely." Claire folded her arms lightly against the cold. "I needed to. I deserved the anger." "You deserved silence," she corrected gently. "Anger still means someone hopes she will change." The words landed hard enough that Ethan briefly looked away toward the rain-streaked skyline. "I did change." Claire studied him quietly for a moment. "Maybe." Ethan stepped slightly closer. "I was a coward that night." She blinked slowly. "Honest. Finally honest." Ethan continued before fear could stop him. "I kept thinking if I stayed calm, if I handled things strategically, the situation would settle down without becoming worse publicly. Claire gave a faint humorless smile. That is exactly the problem. Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Claire looked directly into his eyes now. You treated my humiliation like a business crisis instead of heartbreak. Silence settled heavily between them while distant thunder rolled softly across Manhattan. Ethan had no defense against that because she was right. Completely right. He had spent his entire life solving problems logically. Managing outcomes. Minimizing damage. But love was never supposed to feel managed. Claire leaned lightly against the balcony railing. Do you know what I remember most from that night? Ethan's voice lowered carefully. What? Not the laughter. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the ballroom behind them, glowing with wealth and conversation. Not even Vanessa. She looked back at him. I remember searching your face, waiting for you to choose me publicly. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Claire's voice remained calm, but somehow that made it worse. And when you stayed silent, she swallowed once before finishing quietly. Something inside me stopped trusting love entirely. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. Claire, I swear to you, if I could go back, you cannot, she interrupted softly. That is what makes consequences so terrifying. The ballroom doors suddenly opened behind them before Ethan could answer. Vanessa emerged onto the balcony with a carefully practiced expression of concern. There you are, she said smoothly, though irritation flashed briefly across her eyes at finding them alone together. Ethan's expression cooled instantly. We were talking. Vanessa ignored him completely and focused on Claire instead. I just wanted to say how impressed everyone is by your comeback. Claire recognized the hidden insult immediately. Comeback. As if her success still existed only in relation to her previous humiliation. Thank you, Claire replied calmly. Vanessa smiled tightly. You know, New York really loves reinvention stories. Especially when they involve beautiful gowns and powerful mentors. Ethan's jaw sharpened. Vanessa. But Claire only tilted her head slightly. Interesting. Vanessa continued sweetly. People almost forget where someone came from when they polish themselves well enough. Silence snapped sharply across the balcony. Ethan looked furious now. Margaret Laurent suddenly appeared in the doorway behind Vanessa before Claire even needed to respond. The older woman's expression remained elegant but unmistakably cold. And yet some people, Margaret said calmly, spend their entire lives surrounded by privilege and still never become impressive. Vanessa stiffened immediately. Around them, several nearby guests pretending not to eavesdrop suddenly looked deeply interested in their champagne glasses instead. Margaret stepped beside Claire protectively without touching her. The difference between Claire and most people in this city, Margaret continued smoothly, is that she built herself twice. Vanessa's face flushed slightly beneath the balcony lights. Ethan watched Claire carefully during the exchange, waiting for signs of insecurity or hurt. Instead, Claire simply looked tired. Not wounded. Tired. Like she had outgrown needing revenge against women like Vanessa because their cruelty no longer defined her worth. That realization somehow fascinated Ethan even more. Claire glanced briefly toward Margaret. I think I have had enough fresh air for one evening. Margaret nodded immediately. Of course. Claire looked toward Ethan one final time before turning away. Enjoy the rest of your summit, Mr. Carlyle. Then she walked calmly back into the ballroom beside Margaret Laurent while cameras flashed endlessly beyond the crystal chandeliers. Ethan remained standing alone on the balcony staring after her while rain slid down the Manhattan skyline behind him. Vanessa approached carefully once Claire disappeared back into the crowd. Ethan, do not, he said coldly without looking at her. Vanessa froze. Ethan finally turned toward her slowly. You humiliated her because you thought it would make yourself look powerful. His voice remained dangerously calm. But all it did was expose the kind of person you are. Vanessa stared at him in shock. You are blaming me? After all this time? Ethan looked back toward the ballroom where Claire now stood surrounded by investors, executives, and admiration she earned entirely on her own. "No," he said quietly. "I am blaming myself for ever allowing someone like you near her in the first place." The Carlyle Global Innovation Summit dominated Manhattan headlines for the next 48 hours, but surprisingly, the story reporters could not stop discussing was not Ethan Carlyle's billion-dollar expansion announcement. It was Claire Donovan. The woman who rebuilt herself. L'Oréal International's mysterious strategic genius. The return nobody expected. Photos of Claire descending the marble staircase in ivory silk flooded social media while business magazines suddenly rushed to investigate her career rise across Europe. Fashion blogs praised her elegance. Financial analysts praised her branding instincts. Even gossip columns reluctantly admitted something uncomfortable. The woman once humiliated publicly had returned stronger than everyone involved in her downfall. Claire ignored all of it. By Monday morning she was already back inside L'Oréal International headquarters reviewing a luxury hotel rebranding proposal while Manhattan rain streaked against the penthouse windows. Margaret L'Oréal entered the conference room carrying espresso and several folders beneath one arm. "Congratulations," she said dryly. "You survived New York society." Claire barely looked up from the presentation slides. "Barely." Margaret placed the folders on the table. "That is usually how survival works." Claire finally glanced toward her. "I assume you did not bring me coffee just to discuss gala gossip." Margaret smiled faintly. "Correct." She slid one of the folders across the table. Claire opened it slowly. Then froze. Carlyle Technologies. Her chest tightened immediately. No, Margaret sat calmly across from her. "You have not even read the proposal." "I do not need to." Claire closed the folder instantly. "Absolutely not." Margaret took a sip of espresso without reacting. "Claire." "Margaret, with respect, there are 7 billion people on this planet. I do not need to work with Ethan Carlyle specifically." "Actually," Margaret replied smoothly, "for this contract, you do." Claire stared at her in disbelief. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "Carlyle Technologies is launching a global luxury hospitality division. They requested L'Oréal International lead the entire rebranding strategy." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then assign someone else." Margaret remained perfectly calm. "They specifically requested you." Silence. Claire looked away immediately toward the rain-covered skyline. Of course Ethan requested her. The realization irritated her more than it should have. Margaret watched carefully before speaking again. "You can refuse if you want." Claire crossed her arms. "That sounds suspiciously easy." "Because it is not actually about Ethan." Margaret's voice softened slightly now. "This is the largest branding contract L'Oréal International has received in 5 years. If you walk away from opportunities every time your past becomes uncomfortable, eventually your past still controls you." Claire hated when Margaret was right. Which unfortunately happened often. "You really enjoy emotional torture disguised as business wisdom," Claire muttered quietly. Margaret smiled into her espresso cup. "That is why people pay me." 3 hours later, Claire stood outside the executive conference room at Carlyle Technologies headquarters trying to steady her breathing before entering. The building looked exactly the same as she remembered. Sleek glass architecture. Marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected ceiling lights like water. Employees moving quickly through hallways carrying tablets and coffee cups while speaking in calm, efficient voices. 3 years ago Claire spent enough time inside this building that security guards greeted her by name. Today strangers glanced toward her curiously without recognition. Strange how quickly places forgot people after heartbreak. The conference room doors opened suddenly before Claire could prepare herself further. Ethan Carlyle stood inside wearing a charcoal suit with rolled sleeves and exhaustion beneath his eyes again. For one brief second, both of them simply stared at each other silently. Ethan recovered first. "You came." Claire walked past him into the conference room without answering. Several Carlyle executives already sat around the massive glass table reviewing proposal documents. The moment Claire entered, conversations paused instantly. She recognized some faces from years ago. Most looked stunned to see her sitting here now as L'Oréal International's lead strategist instead of Ethan's disgraced former fiancé. Power changed how rooms treated women. Claire took her seat calmly near the center of the table while assistants distributed presentation packets. Ethan sat directly across from her. Dangerous placement. Too close for emotional safety. The meeting began immediately. Financial projections. Expansion timelines. Luxury consumer analytics. Claire focused entirely on the work because professionalism felt safer than memory. 20 minutes into the discussion, one executive interrupted her branding presentation with a dismissive smile. I still think we should target older luxury demographics instead of emotional storytelling campaigns. Claire met his gaze calmly. Older luxury demographics are dying. The room fell silent briefly. Claire continued without hesitation. Modern consumers spend money emotionally first and logically second. Especially younger high-net-worth audiences. Another executive frowned skeptically. That sounds risky. Claire leaned slightly forward. No. What is risky is pretending the market still behaves like it did 10 years ago. Ethan watched her carefully from across the table while she dismantled outdated strategies with precise confidence. God. She was brilliant. He always knew she was talented, but somewhere between heartbreak and rebuilding herself, Claire had become genuinely formidable. Not loud. Not arrogant. Just impossible to underestimate now. And watching other executives finally realize it filled Ethan with equal parts admiration and regret. The meeting stretched through most of the afternoon. Gradually, even skeptical board members began listening more closely whenever Claire spoke. She explained branding psychology effortlessly, connecting luxury identity with emotional trust in ways that shifted the entire room's strategy direction. By the time the final presentation ended, even the harshest executives looked impressed. As employees slowly exited the conference room afterward, Ethan remained seated quietly while Claire organized her documents. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer felt explosive. Just heavy with history. Ethan finally stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. You were incredible today. Claire continued gathering papers without looking at him. I am aware. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. That confidence is new. Claire glanced up briefly. No. It was always there. I just stopped apologizing for it. The answer lingered heavily between them. Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the window beside him. You hate being here. Claire finally looked at him directly. I hate remembering who I used to be here. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. You mean with me? No, she replied softly. I mean the version of myself who thought love required shrinking. Silence. Ethan looked genuinely affected by that. Claire closed her folder carefully and moved toward the conference room door. Ethan spoke again before she reached it. Claire. She stopped but did not turn around. Ethan's voice lowered carefully. I listened to your voicemail eventually. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folder edge. The voicemail. The one she left the night she walked away. The one he ignored for months because guilt terrified him more than silence. Claire slowly turned back toward him. And? Ethan swallowed hard. You sounded heartbroken. Claire laughed softly without humor. That tends to happen when someone destroys your trust publicly. Ethan stepped closer now, his voice rougher than before. You said you waited for me to choose you. Claire's expression remained unreadable. I did. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. I have regretted that night every single day since. Claire studied him quietly. 3 years ago those words would have shattered her completely. Now they simply sounded sad. Regret is not redemption, Ethan. He nodded slowly because he knew she was right. Claire adjusted the folder against her chest before speaking again. Tomorrow's presentation starts at 8:30. Please have your marketing data finalized before then. Professional. Distant. Controlled. Ethan watched her walk toward the door again and suddenly realized something terrifying. Claire Donovan no longer needed closure from him to move forward with her life. And somehow that hurt infinitely more than rejection ever could. Just before she reached the hallway, Ethan spoke one last time. For what it is worth, Claire paused. You never needed Carlisle to become extraordinary. She stood silently for a second beneath the conference room lights. Then finally answered without turning around. No. I just needed heartbreak. And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving Ethan Carlisle standing alone beside the Manhattan skyline, realizing the woman he once failed to protect had become stronger without him than she ever was beside him.